I'll never listen to carols late at night again without checking the locks 3 times. That night, Christmas Eve, I was house-sitting for my aunt and uncle. Their house is massive, old, and sits far back from the road, surrounded by a thick, silent forest. A heavy snowstorm had blown in just after dusk, coating everything in a thick, insulating blanket of white. The silence was the first thing that got to me. It was a suffocating quiet, broken only by the mournful whine of the wind and the relentless hiss of the gas fireplace. The house was, naturally, aggressively decorated. Every mantel, every doorway, every available surface was draped in tinsel, garland, and flashing LEDs. The air smelled sharp and cold from the 2 enormous pine trees my uncle had jammed into the living room. I was trying to relax on the sofa, watching a terrible holiday movie, when the lights started. It wasn't all of them, just one long, elaborate strand wrapped around the largest tree near the front window. All the other lights would blink in a smooth, synchronized pattern, red, green, gold. But this one strand, about midway up the tree, would stay dark, then flicker on violently, a harsh, frantic white, completely out of rhythm. It was distracting, like a faulty nerve twitching in the corner of my eye. I got up to unplug it, but as I walked past the front window, I stopped. Outside on the covered porch, sitting in a huge wooden rocking chair, was a life-sized, antique wooden Santa figure. It was one of those old, unsettling pieces with fixed, unblinking glass eyes. I remembered my aunt placing it there that morning. But as I looked at it now, I was certain it was facing the wrong way. Earlier, it was facing the road. Now, it was turned, slightly angled toward the living room window, staring straight into the house. I tried to tell myself the wind had moved the chair, but the wooden rocking chair was heavy and the figure was bolted down. I stared at the Santa for a good minute, my pulse starting a slow, heavy beat against my ribs. I decided to ignore it. Wind, I told myself. It was the wind. I turned back toward the sofa, but before I could sit down, I heard it. A faint, low, rhythmic sound coming from upstairs. It was a slow, deliberate thump drag. It was too heavy for a heating duct, too regular for the house settling. It sounded like something large and heavy was being pulled across the floorboards directly over my head. I froze, tilting my head, listening intently. My breathing hitched, shallow and quiet. The thumping stopped immediately, replaced by the silence of the snow and the nervous, strained hum of the Christmas lights. I waited for 20 seconds. Nothing. Then, from the hallway closet that held the cleaning supplies, I heard a very faint, almost inaudible snuff, like someone quickly inhaling air right on the other side of the door. I couldn't move. The faint snuff from the hallway closet felt more threatening than the dragging noise upstairs. It was close, too close. I held my breath, listening until the ringing in my ears became unbearable. My fear went from a low thrum of uneasiness to a frantic, sickening lurch. I knew I wouldn't be able to rest until I checked that closet. I crept across the carpet, my hands outstretched, searching for the wood grain of the closet door. The knob was freezing cold against my palm. I braced myself, yanked the door open, and stabbed the flashlight on my phone into the dark space. It was just a closet. Mops, buckets, a vacuum cleaner tucked into the corner. But the air that rushed out was cold, carrying the sharp scent of pine needles and something metallic, like stale pennies. I slammed the door shut, my breathing now reduced to shallow, painful gasps. I had to find the source of the thump, drag upstairs. That was the only thing I could possibly rationalize as a loose piece of equipment or structural damage. I moved quickly to the grand wooden staircase, my boots creaking loudly on the first steps, betraying my terror. As soon as my feet hit the landing of the second floor, the sound started again. It was closer, louder, and unmistakable. It was coming from the master bedroom directly beside me. Thump, drag, the sound of something impossibly heavy being hauled across the polished hardwood floor, accompanied by the horrible sound of thick fabric scraping wood. I froze, terror flooding my system. I pressed myself flat against the cold, velvet wallpaper of the hall, trying to merge with the wall. Then, the lights died. Not just the dim, buzzing fluorescence, but everything. The fireplace went black. The wind outside seemed to vanish. I was plunged into total lightless darkness, except for one thing, the faulty strand of lights on the massive Christmas tree downstairs. It started up again, faster, more chaotic than before. a frantic, blinding white strobe that flashed every half second, illuminating the hallway, then plunging it back into blackness. Flash, black, flash, black. In those violent bursts of light, the hallway looked distorted and threatening. The shadows lunged and retreated, making the familiar space seem alien and wrong. My heartbeat was a frantic, useless drum solo inside my chest. I heard a muffled sound from downstairs, underneath the strobe light. A heavy, wet thud. It sounded like a bag of concrete dropping onto the wooden floor, followed by the sickening sound of something breaking. The house shuddered slightly under the impact. Flash. I turned and darted my eyes toward the front window, barely visible down the staircase. Flash. The wooden rocking chair on the porch was empty. It was covered in a dusting of snow, but the large, antique Santa figure was gone. The sound of thump, drag stopped upstairs. It was replaced by a new sound, coming from the foot of the stairs directly below me. A slow, heavy squelch, like something large and damp was pulling itself onto the first step. The smell of pine and cold metallic air was overwhelming now. I flattened myself against the wall, fighting the urge to scream. I knew, without any doubt, that whatever had been upstairs and whatever had been on the porch was now on the stairs, and it was coming up for me. I couldn't scream. The terror was too heavy, too real, a crushing weight pressing me into the floor. The slow, wet squelch of whatever was on the stairs was the only sound now, replacing the rhythm of my own heart. Flash. The strobe light from the tree below momentarily blinded me. In that violent, white burst, I saw it. It was massive, filling the width of the wooden stairs. It was mostly shrouded in shadow, but I caught the glimpse of a dark, wet silhouette, bulky and inhumanly wide. I saw the rough texture of fabric, heavy, red, and soaked, scraping against the wood. It was moving too slowly, too deliberately, to be a person. The heavy, ragged breathing I had heard earlier was audible now, a wet, rasping sound right at the level of the banister. The air immediately around me grew sickeningly thick with the smell of decay and pine. Flash. I saw its hand. It was enormous and dark, gripping the mahogany railing. The skin looked rough, cracked, and something dark and viscous dripped from the knuckles onto the polished wood. My paralysis broke. I scrambled backward on my hands and knees, clawing my way off the landing and into the nearest available refuge, a tiny, unheated linen closet. I pulled the flimsy door shut, my body shaking uncontrollably. I didn't dare latch it. The click would be deafening. Squish, squish. The steps continued, passing the landing. It was now moving down the hallway, right outside the closet door. The strobe light continued its frantic, terrifying rhythm. The flashes made the thin wood of the closet door seem translucent. I pressed myself against the back wall, biting down hard on my own arm to stifle a scream. The weight stopped right outside the door. I could hear the heavy, wet exhale of the thing, inches from my head. The raw scent of metallic decay was overwhelming. I waited for the door to be ripped from its hinges. I waited for the heavy hand to smash through the wood. Instead, the light outside gave one final, desperate pop fizzle. And then, everything was absolute darkness and silence. I stayed in that closet, huddled on the cold floor for what felt like the rest of the night. My breathing was slow and shallow, barely a whisper. I didn't move until the first, weak gray light of Christmas morning finally filtered through the tiny, high window of the closet. When I finally pushed the door open, the hallway was still. The house was cold, but otherwise normal. I crept downstairs. The stairs were clean. The living room was quiet. The only evidence of the terror was the dead, dark Christmas tree and the faint, cold scent of decay. But as I reached the bottom of the staircase, I noticed a tear, a small piece of rough, red velvet fabric, snagged cleanly on a decorative curl of the railing. I walked into the living room, my eyes searching wildly. The antique wooden Santa was no longer on the porch. It was standing directly next to the cold, dead fireplace, staring straight up the chimney. Its enormous red jacket was damp, almost black in places, and snagged on the front was a small, torn strip of the same velvet I had found on the stairs. I looked at the Santa's face. Its fixed glass eyes were glistening under the faint gray light of morning, and I realized with sickening clarity that the wooden eyes were wet. It wasn't frost. The Santa was weeping. I left the house and never looked back. I don't know what was dragged upstairs and then hauled back down, but sometimes when I see a large, heavy figure standing motionless in the window, I wonder what the old Santa saw that night, or if it was simply shedding the skin of its disguise. This happened last Christmas, and honestly, if I hadn't seen the evidence myself, I'd assume I had a nervous breakdown. I work for a large tech company in Seattle, and around the holidays, they offered double pay for covering the emergency systems shift. I took it, mostly for the money, but also because I had nowhere else to be. The company headquarters is a massive, brand new skyscraper, all glass and steel. On Christmas Eve, it's completely deserted. The security team locks down the entire building at 6 p.m., and only 2 people are allowed inside. The main security guard downstairs, Frank, and me, the lone IT guy, on the 30th floor. I was settled into the server monitoring room, surrounded by banks of blinking lights. The air conditioning hummed, keeping the racks cool, but the rest of the building was silent, eerily silent. I had brought a tiny, battery-operated Christmas tree and put it on my desk, mostly for the irony. Its single blinking red light was the only splash of color in the monochrome room. Around 10 p.m., things got weird. I was watching a movie on my tablet when the room's main monitor, the one displaying the building-wide security feed, suddenly switched from the static floor map to a live camera feed. It was camera 4 in the main lobby, pointed directly at the massive, professionally decorated 20-foot Christmas tree the company always puts up. I glanced over. The system sometimes glitches, so I was about to switch it back when I noticed the lighting. All the lobby lights were off, as they should be, but the tree lights were also completely dark. Then, one single strand of lights on the tree, right near the top, flickered on, just one section. Then, it went dark. I checked the security log. No power fluctuation alert, no maintenance request. I called Frank downstairs. He answered on the second ring, sounding sleepy. "Frank, is there anyone in the lobby? I just saw a light flicker on camera 4. Frank sighed. "Nah, kid. Place is locked down tighter than a drum. Probably a reflection or a power blip on the feed. I'm looking at the doors right now. They're all solid green." I told him about the single strand of lights. He chuckled. "The maintenance crew put those on a fancy timer. Maybe it's malfunctioning. Don't worry about it." I hung up, feeling a bit foolish. Okay, a timer glitch. It made sense. I switched the feed back to the map. 10 minutes later, the internal emergency phone on my desk rang. It's a red phone, meant only for true system failures or medical emergencies. I answered quickly. "Hello, IT monitoring?" All I heard on the other end was heavy, wet breathing. It was too close to the mic, like someone was holding the receiver right up to their mouth and sucking air in. "Hello? Who is this?" The breathing continued for 3 sickeningly long seconds. Then, a voice, deep and distorted, like it was speaking through a paper towel tube, whispered one single word, "Ho." Then the line went dead. The dial tone was replaced by the low, insistent drone of silence. I didn't call Frank this time. I looked back at the security monitor. The main map was still up, but on the 30th floor, my floor, the little icon representing the fire escape door in the north hallway, a door that was supposed to be locked and alarmed, had just switched from solid green to flashing red. The flashing red icon on the security map was a physical jolt. That fire escape door, located at the end of the north hallway, was dead-bolted, alarmed, and sealed for the night. For that icon to flash red, the sensor had to be tripped, meaning the lock mechanism was engaged, or, impossibly, the door had been opened. I grabbed the red emergency phone again and called Frank. "Frank, the north fire exit on 30 just went red. Alarm tripped." Frank sounded instantly awake, his voice tight. "What? That's impossible. That door hasn't been used in years. I haven't gotten an alert down here." "Well, the IT feed shows it flashing red. Check your panel." There was a muffled sound of Frank shuffling equipment. A few seconds later, he swore under his breath. "You're right. The main alarm board is showing a fault on 30 North, but it's not showing a door open signal, just a lock tamper. I just got a weird call on the internal red line too," I said, keeping the details about the breathing and the whispered "ho" to myself. I didn't want to sound completely insane yet. Something is wrong up here. Stay put, Frank ordered. I'm initiating lockdown protocol, securing the stairs, and I'm sending a security bot up to your floor. Don't leave the server room until I call you back. I felt a slight tremor in the floor as the automated security doors in the stairwells slammed shut. The silence of the building returned, but now it felt loaded, like the moment right before thunder. The server room was built like a vault, but the main door was just glass. I could see out into the short, carpeted hallway leading to the rest of the 30th floor. I gripped the heavy, old-fashioned flashlight I kept on my desk. A minute later, the security bot arrived. It was a little automated cart designed to patrol and take video. It stopped right outside the glass door and emitted a faint, high-pitched whir. I checked the bot's live feed on the screen. It showed the empty hallway, the Christmas decorations hanging forlornly from the drop-ceiling tiles, and the endless rows of unused cubicles stretching into the darkness. Everything looked normal, except for the end of the north hallway, where the door alarm had tripped. I watched the bot slowly pivot and begin its long, methodical patrol towards the north wing. The wheels made a soft, rubbery sound on the carpet. As the bot moved past the central reception area, the camera feed did something strange. It stuttered, flashed, white, and then the image returned. But something had changed. On one of the empty reception desks, right in the center, was a small, meticulously wrapped package. It was covered in sparkling red foil and tied with a thick gold bow. It hadn't been there a moment ago. I knew it hadn't. My stomach clenched. I zoomed the bot's camera in on the package. It looked perfectly festive, completely out of place on the cold, gray laminate. As the bot wheeled closer, I noticed a small white tag sticking out from under the bow. The bot paused, and I used the remote interface to angle the camera down. Written on the tag, in thick, crude, black lettering, was a single word, 4. Before I could process that, the bot reached the gift. As its camera focused, the gift moved. It wasn't a bump or a shift. The small red package vibrated, emitting a faint, high-pitched whine that the bot's microphone picked up clearly. The sound started low, like a trapped insect, and then rose quickly to an unbearable screech. Then, right as the sound peaked, the package ripped itself open. The red foil tore violently, and something small, dark, and fast exploded out of the wrappings. The bot's camera feed immediately cut to static. The screen went dark, and the little cart icon on my map instantly disappeared. I could still hear a faint, metallic clatter echo from the main hallway, followed by the terrifying, familiar sound of heavy, wet breathing. This time, it was much closer. Right outside the glass, my blood ran cold. The breathing was right there, on the other side of the glass door. I was paralyzed, holding the useless flashlight, staring into the dark reflection of the room on the glass. I didn't dare turn on the overhead lights. I felt safer in the gloom. I pressed my back against the server racks, the faint vibrations of the machinery, a cold, hard comfort. Then, a shadow moved in the reflection. It was tall, bulkier than a normal human, and it stood silently just outside the glass door. I couldn't make out any features, just the distinct silhouette of a large figure facing the door. A slow, scraping noise began. It sounded like thick leather, dragging against the synthetic carpet. The sound paused, right at the doorframe. Then, the red emergency phone on my desk, the one that had whispered, "Ho," began to ring again. The sound was deafening in the silence. I didn't move. I kept my eyes locked on the shadow. The figure outside the door slowly lifted an arm. A large, thick-gloved hand came into view, and it reached out, resting flat against the glass right where the lock mechanism was. I could see the reflection of a large, dark cuff of something heavy, like a winter coat or a thick fur lining. As the hand pressed against the glass, the red phone stopped ringing. The building suddenly felt completely inert, drained of all power. Then, the breathing started again, louder and more ragged than before. The figure was standing so close to the door that I could feel the vibrations of its exhalations through the glass. I forced my eyes away from the hand and down to the floor, and that's when I saw it. The thing that confirmed this wasn't just a disturbed coworker or a desperate intruder. On the dark carpet, directly under the figure, was a faint, intermittent glow. It was a single, tiny light flashing rapidly from below the hem of what looked like heavy, worn fabric. I squinted, trying to make sense of the color. It was red. As the figure shifted its weight, the breathing paused, and I heard a metallic click. The small red light on the floor stopped flashing and became solid. I realized what I was seeing. The figure was wearing something with an active sensor, and when it shifted, it had somehow used its foot or the bottom of its heavy boot to activate the sensor beneath it. But this was the most crucial detail. That precise point on the floor was where the bot's emergency beacon was supposed to sit. The small, quick thing that had torn itself out of the red package. It hadn't just disabled the bot. It had attached itself to the figure. It was some kind of targeting or tracking device, and it was now affixed to the intruder. My mind raced. Someone was up here, possibly injured, equipped with strange technology and capable of moving silently and tripping precise alarms. And they were now standing right outside. The small, activated red light confirming their presence. I heard a low, almost guttural voice finally speak. It wasn't the broken singing or the whispered ho from before. This was a deeper, more demanding sound, and it was just slightly muffled, as if the person was wearing a full ski mask or maybe a heavy helmet. "The clock is running," it rasped, the words echoing unnaturally off the glass. "The gift cannot be denied." Then, with startling speed, the figure backed away from the glass door. The small red light under its feet winked out as the sensor was deactivated. The shadow dissolved back into the dark hallway. Frank called back, sounding frantic. "I see something on the heat signature camera on the 30th. It's gone now, but it was massive. Too big to be a person. I'm calling the police." I never spoke to Frank again after that night. The police found the missing security bot, disassembled and flattened, in a service closet on the 30th floor. They dismissed the red package and the whispering as my imagination and the stress of the isolation. But when I finally returned to the office a week later, they still hadn't fixed the damage. Right outside the server room door, where the figure had stood, the heavy carpet was scored into the thick industrial fibers, as if etched with a large, blunt object, were 3 precise, deep lines. They weren't letters, but symbols. They looked exactly like a crude, massive version of 3 reindeer footprints. I quit that day. I left the city. I still wonder what that thing was. Human, technology, or something ancient wearing a suit. And whether the real gift was what came out of the package, or simply the fact that it chose to leave me alive. I'll never forget that night. It wasn't the kind of memory you make when you're out having fun, but the kind that claws its way into your mind every time you try to relax. It happened 3 years ago, almost exactly to the day, on Christmas Eve. It was a perfect, cliché, snowy Christmas Eve in my small apartment in Vermont. The kind where the snow is falling in big, slow flakes outside the window, making everything look quiet and muffled. I was 22, home alone after my roommates had gone back to their families for the holidays. I didn't have the money for the flight, so I decided to tough it out and enjoy the solitude. I had the cheap plastic Christmas tree plugged in, the multicolored lights casting these flickering, nostalgic shadows on the walls. I was wrapped in a blanket, watching a bad old movie, with a mug of hot chocolate sitting on the coffee table. The silence of the apartment was honestly the best part. You could hear the old buildings settle, the faint tick-tock of the clock in the hall, and the gentle hush of the wind against the glass. The first thing that broke the peace wasn't a loud noise, but a lack of one. The lights on the tree, those cheap, cheerful ones, started to flicker. Not a sudden, dramatic outage, but a slow, almost agonizing stutter. They'd brighten, then dim, then snap back on, all in an irregular rhythm. I figured it was just the ancient wiring of the place and barely glanced up. Then, about 20 minutes later, I heard it, a sound from the floorboards above me. My apartment was on the ground floor. The apartment above was supposed to be empty. My landlord had explicitly told me the tenants had moved out the week before, and the place was being prepped for renovations in the new year. I knew the apartment was empty. The sound was distinct. It was the soft, almost hesitant creak of a single footstep. It sounded heavy, like someone was slowly moving across the main room, right over where my sofa was. My heart gave a little hitch, but I tried to rationalize it. Wind? Expansion? Maybe the landlord had forgotten something. I listened intently, my movie now just a pointless drone in the background. The snow outside continued its silent fall. A minute passed. 2. Nothing. I started to relax, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then came the next sound. This one was different. It wasn't a footstep. It was like something being dragged. A slow, heavy scrape that stuttered every few feet, then continued. It sounded like a burlap sack full of stones being pulled across the rough wood floor. My breath hitched in my throat, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. This was definitely not the wind. I muted the television. The scraping stopped directly above my head. And that's when I heard the whispering, faint, breathy like the sound of static or dry leaves rustling. It was a murmur, but it wasn't English. It wasn't any language I recognized. It just sounded like 2 or 3 voices, all speaking at once, in a quick, excited rush, right over my head. My hands started to shake, and I felt the blood draining from my face. I grabbed my phone, ready to dial the landlord, when the whispers abruptly cut off. A slow, deliberate thump echoed through the ceiling, directly above me. It was followed by another, and then a third. It sounded exactly like someone was knocking on the floor, calling down to me. I stayed perfectly still, clutching my phone so hard my knuckles were white. My heart was hammering against my ribs, making my thin cotton pajamas feel tight. The methodical thump stopped after the third knock. The silence that followed was heavy and thick, completely different from the comforting quiet earlier. Now, it felt oppressive, like the air itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to stand up. My legs felt weak and clumsy, and the floorboards under my own feet seemed to creak louder than usual. I took a shaky breath and whispered, "Hello?" My voice sounded pathetically small in the dark room. No response. I rationalized again. Maybe one of the movers came back for something they forgot, and they were just being incredibly rude and loud. But what was the scraping and the whispering? I went over to the front door, just to check that the deadbolt was secure. It was. Then I realized something truly disturbing. The sounds I'd heard, the footsteps, the scraping, the whispers, the knocking, they had all come from one very specific spot in the ceiling, right over the fireplace mantel. It wasn't the sound of someone walking around an entire apartment. It was localized. I walked back into the living room, my eyes fixed on the ceiling. The cheap string lights on the trees suddenly blinked out completely, plunging the room into near darkness. Only the streetlights outside and the faint glow of the snow provided illumination. It was in that dim light that I saw it. The dust. The ceiling was made of old, textured plaster. Right above the mantel, where the knocking had come from, there was a tiny, faint stream of gray dust drifting down, disturbed and falling like slow-motion rain onto the edge of the mantelpiece. Something had definitely scraped or rubbed against the ceiling from the inside of the floorboards above. My breath became shallow. I wasn't just afraid anymore. I was entering a state of sheer panic. My mind raced through every horrible possibility. A squatter, a secret hidden compartment, an animal. But none of those explained the intentional, distinct knocking. Then it came again. Not a footstep, not a knock. It was a single, long groan. The kind of low, agonizing sound someone makes when they are trying desperately to lift something too heavy, or when they are in serious physical pain. It started low, built in volume just slightly, and then faded out, muffled by the structure of the floor ceiling. I didn't think about calling the landlord or the police. My only coherent thought was, I have to see what that is. I grabbed the small metal fireplace poker from beside the hearth. It was heavy and offered a false sense of security. I looked up at the ceiling, right where the dust was still slowly falling. I lifted the poker, my hand shaking violently, and tapped the ceiling lightly. Just once. Tap. The response was immediate and terrifying. Instead of a knock, I heard a quick, frantic scratching, like an animal with long fingernails trying to claw its way through wood. It was fast, desperate, and sounded like it was right against the plaster, just inches away from me. I dropped the poker with a loud clang. I squeezed my eyes shut and clapped my hands over my ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was too loud, too close. And then, above the scratching, a voice. Clearer this time. It wasn't the static whispering I heard before. This was a single, raspy, wet sound. It It sounded like it was trying to sing a Christmas carol, a mangled, off-key, horrifying attempt at Jingle Bells. The tune was recognizable, but the voice was raw and broken, and it ended in a sound that was less like singing and more like a choked sob. My breath stopped in my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even pray. My eyes snapped open, looking directly at the dust-streaked ceiling. And I saw it. The ceiling plaster, where the dust had been falling, slowly, deliberately, began to bulge downward. The bulging started slowly, like heavy water gathering in an old balloon. It was maybe the size of a dinner plate. A dark, damp discoloration began to spread across the plaster, right in the center of the bulge. I could hear the tiny, sickening sound of the drywall and plaster cracking under pressure. I took 3 huge, stumbling steps backward until my back hit the kitchen counter. I didn't care about the metal poker or the fire now. All I could do was stare at the ceiling, waiting for it to give way. The singing had stopped, replaced by shallow, rapid breathing. It was a panicked, dry sound, and it was coming from inside the ceiling. I could feel the vibrations of it in the very structure of the building. And then, the bulge split. It wasn't a huge collapse. It was a precise, terrifying tear. A crack appeared in the plaster, running diagonally across the dark, wet patch. And from that crack, something pushed through. It wasn't a hand, or a shoe, or anything large. It was a piece of cheap, red material. It was cloth, soaked and darkened, pushed through the narrow fissure like a wet tongue. It moved slightly, like whatever was up there was shifting its weight. The cloth was familiar, too familiar. It was the color and texture of the velvet on a cheap, store-bought Santa hat. My entire body went rigid. I suddenly remembered what the landlord had said. The tenants moved out last week. If the apartment was empty, and if the movers had left, what was up there trapped between my ceiling and the floorboards above? And what was it doing, singing a broken carol and trying to push itself through the structure? I watched the red cloth. The breathing above me grew shallower, faster. I could smell something now, a faint, sour odor, like stale sweat and wet wool. Then, a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of white pushed out next to the red fabric. It looked like a finger. It was too pale, too thin, and it didn't move like a human finger. It wiggled once, quickly, like an insect's antenna. I couldn't stay anymore. The sheer, overwhelming reality of something trapped and alive right above my head, breathing and scratching, was too much. I spun around, grabbed my keys and wallet from the table without looking, and wrenched the front door open. The snow outside was beautiful, silent and clean. I ran without bothering to close the door, plunging out into the quiet street, wearing nothing but my pajamas and thin socks. I ran 3 blocks to the nearest all-night diner, shivering uncontrollably, the cold a welcome distraction from the terror. I never went back to the apartment. I called the landlord from the diner phone, stuttering out a story about a massive pipe burst and water damage. He sounded annoyed, but he agreed to go check it out the next morning. When he called me back, his voice was different, flat and quiet. He said he found my apartment door open, and he saw the red fabric hanging from the ceiling crack. He said he went upstairs and checked the apartment above. He confirmed it was empty, and the access panel to the subfloor was screwed shut and untouched. He said he called the super to fix the ceiling and had them throw away the wet rag that had fallen out. I pressed him. What else did you see? Did you look closely at the floor above the crack? He hesitated, then sighed. Look, I don't know what kind of prank you were playing, but there was a small, freshly chewed bone in the middle of the floor above your ceiling crack. The kind you'd get in a Christmas ham, but completely stripped, that's all. Now get your stuff. He hung up, clearly wanting the issue to be over. I've never had an explanation. Was it a squatter? A mentally ill person who got trapped in the walls? Or was it something else? Something that came out only on Christmas Eve, attracted by the festive lights and the smell of pine, leaving behind only a piece of cheap velvet and a stripped bone as a disturbing holiday gift? I don't know, but to this day, the sound of jingling bells makes my heart seize up, and I avoid basements and attics like the plague. I still have nightmares about the bulging plaster and that broken, rasping, festive song. This story happened to my grandmother. but she told it to me so many times over the years that it feels like my own memory, a cold little sliver of glass buried deep in my mind. It was Christmas, 1957, and she was spending the holidays alone for the first time in their new sprawling Victorian house. Her husband was deployed overseas, and the silence of the old place was getting to her. The house was cold, full of drafty hallways and long shadows, but the living room, with the big pine tree, was cozy. The tree was always the most important thing to her. She believed the tree held the spirit of the season. She had been unpacking boxes of inherited decorations, things she'd never seen before, from her husband's side of the family. Most of it was standard dusty tinsel and faded balls. But then she found a small, heavy wooden crate tucked away at the bottom of the last box. Inside, nestled in dark, brittle velvet, was a single ornament. It was an angel, but unlike any she'd ever seen. It wasn't cherubic or gilded. It was made of deep, almost black stained glass, and it was unnervingly realistic. Its face was carved in an expression of quiet, profound sorrow. The wings were jagged, like cracked ice, and it hung from a loop of tarnished silver wire. She didn't like it. It felt cold, heavy, and ancient. But she had this superstitious feeling that since it was family tradition, she had to hang it. She placed the glass angel high up on a thick branch near the trunk, hoping it would be hidden by the lush needles. That night, she was sitting by the fire, reading, when she heard a subtle sound from the tree. It wasn't a creak from the stand or the snap of a cooling branch. It was a faint, crystalline tink. She looked over. The tree lights were casting beautiful, dancing colors on the ornaments, but she couldn't tell what made the noise. She went back to her book. It was happening again. It sounded exactly like the small glass angel was gently hitting another nearby ornament. A soft, persistent chime in the quiet room. But here's the thing. There was no air movement. The fire was steady, the windows were sealed, and the central heating hadn't kicked on yet. The air in the room was perfectly still. The branches of the tree weren't swaying. She walked up to the tree, intending to move the angel to a less crowded spot. She peered into the thick pine needles. The angel was exactly where she left it, but the light hit it just right, and she saw what was making the noise. The angel wasn't hitting another ornament. The sound was coming from inside the angel itself. She leaned in closer. The black glass was so thick and opaque that she couldn't see anything inside, but the faint sound of glass tapping on glass was undeniable. It was a rhythmic, gentle, internal knocking. Then, the tapping stopped, and she heard, almost directly at her ear, a breathy, dry sound, like dust moving across sandpaper. It was a whisper, so low she could barely parse it. "Help me." She jumped back, knocking over a stack of magazines. She stared at the angel. Its black, sorrowful eyes seemed to reflect the firelight with a cold, unsettling intensity. She grabbed the nearest thing, a book, and threw it hard at the tree. It hit a lower branch with a soft thud. The angel did not move. It just hung there, silent, radiating a palpable coldness that seemed to counteract the warmth of the fire. She told herself it was the drafts, the old wiring, the stress of being alone. She backed away slowly, never taking her eyes off the single dark ornament hidden amongst the festive lights. My grandmother couldn't sleep that night. She stayed up, curled on the sofa, watching the tree with a blanket pulled up to her chin. The fire eventually died down, leaving the room illuminated only by the faint, multicolored glow of the string lights. She didn't hear the tapping again. The angel hung motionless, a dark presence on the green branches. But as the hours stretched toward dawn, she noticed something else profoundly unsettling happening with the tree lights. The lights near the glass angel were slowly dying out. It wasn't a sudden fuse blow. It was an incremental, creeping process. A blue bulb nearest the ornament dimmed to a sickly purple, then winked out. The red one next to it faded to a dull brown before its filament expired. It seemed that any light bulb within a foot of the angel was being subtly and systematically drained of power or life until it went dark. By 3 a.m., the entire section of the tree surrounding the angel was a growing black void. The effect was horrifying, a central pillar of darkness, defined by the heavy shadow of the ornament, contrasted sharply with the vibrant, flickering colors everywhere else. She realized then why the angel looked so sad. It wasn't sorrow. It was exhaustion. As the last light near the angel went out, my grandmother felt a sudden, sharp drop in the room's temperature. It was localized. The air around the tree felt like stepping into an open freezer. She could see her own breath faintly misting in the air, even though the thermometer on the wall read 68 degrees. She got up again, drawn by a terrifying curiosity. Her heart was beating rapidly, making a loud, dull thump in the silent house. She slowly approached the tree, her hand outstretched. As she neared the black void in the branches, she saw the angel move. It didn't swing on the branch. It tilted. Very slowly, agonizingly slowly, the glass angel tilted its head down, as if making eye contact with her. The glass of its body was no longer opaque. As it tilted, the remaining lights from the bottom of the tree shone upward, and she could now see a subtle shimmer inside the angel. It wasn't empty. There was something in there, pressed against the curved glass of its belly. It looked like fine, white powder, slowly swirling, agitated by the movement. But as she watched it, mesmerized, the powder began to coalesce, to form vague, miniature shapes. She stood frozen, inches from the tree. Her breathing became shallow and fast, leaving her lightheaded. She was looking into a reflection, a distortion in the glass, and yet it was absolutely real. She saw the tiny shape of a house, then a small figure standing next to it. The figure, made of the swirling white dust, raised a minuscule arm. The image inside the glass angel didn't move like a reflection. It moved like a memory, playing out inside a prison of black glass. And then, with a sickening clarity that pierced the heavy silence, she understood the sight. The figure inside the ornament was wearing the uniform of an American soldier, and the tiny house looked exactly like her house, her home, in the small town she had moved into only weeks before. A wave of paralyzing nausea washed over her. She knew, instantly and deeply, that this ornament was a vessel, a container for a lost soul, perhaps trapped in the same sorrowful house, feeding on the light and the warmth of the season. She stumbled backward, tripping over the heavy rug. As she hit the floor, her eyes snapped shut in a panic. When she opened them, the angel was still, tilted slightly, staring right at her, and she felt a sudden, profound mental intrusion. Not a voice, but a feeling of intense, crushing loneliness, mixed with a chilling, possessive yearning. It wasn't the feeling of her husband overseas. It was the crushing weight of decades, of being forgotten and left behind. My grandmother lay on the floor for what felt like an eternity, unable to move. The cold emanating from the tree was now a suffocating pressure, specifically targeting her chest, making it difficult to draw breath. She felt utterly vulnerable, exposed on the cold hardwood floor of a house that didn't feel like her own anymore. The feeling of intense loneliness that had invaded her mind didn't recede. It stayed, a heavy, alien presence nestled right behind her own thoughts. It was the crushing emptiness of a Christmas spent waiting, year after year, for a return that never happened. She slowly pushed herself up, using the side of the sofa for leverage. She didn't look at the angel this time. She focused on the task, getting out. She had to remove the ornament. She knew that if she didn't get rid of it, the cold, the draining of the lights, and that dreadful presence would consume the entire room, and eventually, her. She fumbled for the heavy metal shears she kept in the sewing basket nearby. She wouldn't touch the angel. She would cut the branch. She approached the tree one final time, the cold air hitting her face like a slap. The scent of pine was thick, but underneath it, she now detected a faint, acrid smell, like burnt sugar or stale dust. She located the ornament in the circle of darkness and positioned the shears. She aimed to snip the thick branch as far away from the angel as possible. As the steel blades bit into the wood, the angel moved again. This time, it didn't tilt. It swung violently, not side to side, but in a small, tight, frantic circle, like a captured bird trying to escape its cage. A burst of sound erupted from the glass, not the gentle tapping, but a sharp, high-pitched screech, like fingernails dragging across a slate blackboard. The sound lasted only a second, but it felt like it tore a hole in the silence of the night. The shears snapped the branch. My grandmother didn't hesitate. She threw the entire branch, angel and all, toward the open fireplace. It landed with a puff of ash on the cool stone hearth, away from the dead embers. She watched, frozen, as the angel struck the stone. The branch didn't break, and the ornament didn't shatter. It merely lay there, motionless, dark, and silent. The instant it left the tree, the intense cold vanished. The air in the room warmed instantly, and she could breathe freely again. She left the branch on the hearth and retreated back to the sofa, pulling the heavy blanket tight. She sat there until the real sun rose, flooding the room with cold, gray light. When she finally gathered the courage to look, the branch was still on the hearth. The glass angel was gone. She searched everywhere, the carpet, the hearth, the chimney, but it was gone. She decided the heat from the hearth must have caused the glass to subtly degrade and disintegrate into ash she couldn't see. Or maybe she had simply misplaced it in her panic. She never spoke of it to anyone except me, years later. Her husband returned 2 months later, perfectly fine, and they lived a long, happy life in that old Victorian house. But when she was old, fragile, and packing up the house to move into a retirement home, she called me over to help. We were taking down the Christmas decorations from the attic one last time. She opened an old cardboard ornament box, one she hadn't touched since the year they moved in, and gasped. Tucked into the tissue paper, right on top, was a single tarnished silver wire, and hanging from that wire was a small, tattered piece of red silk ribbon. The ribbon looked untouched by time, but tied around it in a perfect, elaborate knot was a small, swirling pile of white, glass-like dust. That was the angel's ribbon, she whispered, her voice thin and shaking. I never put that ribbon on the tree. It was the wire. She didn't touch it. I picked up the ribbon, and as I did, the white dust shifted and swirled, forming a momentary, distinct shape, a tiny, sorrowful face, looking straight up at me. I dropped the box. When I looked back, the ribbon and the dust were gone. Only the empty silver wire remained, cold to the touch. I still wonder if the angel shattered into that dust, or if it simply escaped, taking only its memory with it. And I wonder if the angel's true purpose wasn't to drain the light, but to find the home it was trapped in, and to ensure that the lonely, sorrowful soldier, or whatever was trapped in the glass, would never truly leave. This happened when I was 19, home from my first semester of college, staying with my parents in their quiet suburban town. It was the week before Christmas, bitterly cold, and the air smelled sharp, like pine and freezing dust. My part-time job was at a local grocery store, stocking shelves late at night. I usually got off around 1 a.m., and since it was too short a distance to justify driving, I always walked home. The quickest route took me past the town's seasonal Christmas tree lot. It was usually chaotic and bright during the day, but at night, it was just a stretch of asphalt surrounded by chain-link fence, crammed full of dark, silent trees. They kept a single halogen floodlight on the little shack where they took payments, but it barely penetrated the forest of evergreens. It was about 1:15 a.m. The sky was cloudy, so there were no stars, and the entire street felt heavy with shadow. As I walked, I kept my hands shoved deep into my pockets, trying to ignore the way the rows of dark trees seemed to lean out over the fence. As I passed the center of the lot, I heard a sound. A tiny sound, easily dismissed. It was a faint, dry scratching. I slowed my pace, listening intently. It sounded like something rubbing against the rough bark of a pine tree. A branch moving in the wind, maybe? I checked the trees. They were perfectly still. No wind at all. I kept walking, telling myself it was probably a raccoon or a stray cat trapped inside the fence. But then the scratching stopped, and a new sound began. It was a rhythmic snip, like a pair of heavy shears cutting through something tough. This was far less dismissible. No animal makes that sound. I stopped completely, turning to face the black silhouette of the lot. The sound was coming from deep within the trees, far away from the road, where the single floodlight barely reached. My heart started to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew I should just walk faster, but my feet felt rooted to the cold pavement. I edged closer to the fence, squinting into the darkness. The shadows between the trees were absolute, impossible to penetrate. I was about to turn away when I saw it. Something moved, not a branch, but a defined shape. It was white, and it was moving slowly, purposefully, between the trunks. It was too low to be a person standing up, but too large to be an animal. I held my breath, straining my eyes. The white shape stopped moving and remained perfectly still, nestled between the dark, vertical lines of the trees. The rhythmic snip stopped too. In the dead silence that followed, I heard a new sound, very close to the fence where I was standing. It was a soft, wet exhalation, a sound of air being slowly, deliberately released. And then, a tiny piece of something fluttered down from above the fence, landing right at my feet on the pavement. I lowered my flashlight and aimed the beam down. It was a piece of white thread, about 3 inches long. It was fine, like embroidery floss, and it was slightly stiff. As I stared at it, I realized what the white shape must be. One of the old, heavy-duty tarps they used to cover the stacks of leftover wreaths. It had probably been snagged on a branch, and the wind, or maybe an animal, was tearing it. I felt a huge wave of relief wash over me. I laughed weakly, feeling the tension drain away. But then I saw the other thing on the ground. Right next to the piece of white thread, there was a single, small, green plastic eye. It was the cheap, hollow kind you find on old, worn-out stuffed animals. It wasn't broken, it was whole, and it was staring up at the light of my flashlight. The sight of the green plastic eye on the pavement instantly wiped away any sense of relief. It wasn't an animal tearing a tarp. It was something manufactured. And the silence had returned, thick and absolute, broken only by my own ragged breathing. I stared into the darkness of the tree lot, my flashlight beam cutting a weak path through the shadows. My mind struggled to connect the pieces. The scratching, the cutting sound, the piece of white thread, and the detached, staring eye. I slowly backed away from the fence, my eyes never leaving the area where the white shape had been. My heart hammered against my chest with a dull, heavy insistence. I could feel the cold radiating off the asphalt through the thin soles of my boots. I didn't turn to run. Fear had locked my muscles, but curiosity, or perhaps a more primal instinct, held my gaze. I focused my beam on the point where I'd last seen the white mass. The shadows were dancing, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized the mass hadn't been an abandoned tarp. It was vertical. It was thin, too thin for a person, but it was standing up, right in the center of the dense trees. As I watched, trying to breathe evenly, the figure slowly, deliberately, began to move out of the deep shadow and into the fringe of the floodlight. It moved with a strange, gliding motion, unnervingly smooth and slow, without any visible effort or stepping. And as it came into the weak light, I finally saw what it was. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet. The white material I had seen was wrapped around its entire body, like a shroud or a tightly bound canvas. It had no discernible features, no head, no limbs in the usual sense, just the huge, tapering column of white. But what truly paralyzed me was the top of the shape. It was crowned with a bristling, uneven tangle of pine needles and small branches, as if it had been woven directly into the tops of the Christmas trees. It looked like a grotesque, living extension of the lot itself. The thing stopped moving and tilted slightly toward me. I felt the familiar weight of the atmosphere change. The air grew heavy, like it was pulling the oxygen out of my lungs. I didn't hear a sound, but I felt a strong pressure, a mental command, wash over me. It wasn't spoken. It was imprinted directly onto my consciousness. Stay. My muscles twitched, fighting the sudden, heavy inertia. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet remained glued. The pressure was overwhelming. Then, the creature, or whatever it was, shifted its mass. The movement was barely perceptible, a subtle ripple in the white fabric. And as it shifted, I heard a terrible, internal sound, a sound of wood breaking, of fibers tearing, magnified inside my own skull. Suddenly, a massive, gnarled section of the chain-link fence, the section closest to me, warped inward. The metal shrieked and groaned as it bent, the posts straining, pulled by an unseen, tremendous force originating from the center of the lot. I saw the white shape lift what I assumed was a bound arm, a large, blunt mass wrapped in the shroud, and slowly reached toward the damaged fence. The air around it seemed to shimmer, and where its hand reached, a patch of the white fabric pulled taut. My mind finally broke through the paralysis. This wasn't a prank or an animal. This was wrong. I wrenched myself free and turned to run, adrenaline surging through me. As I bolted down the sidewalk, away from the lot, I felt a sharp, stinging pain on the back of my neck, like a sudden, intense burn. I didn't look back. I ran the rest of the way home, burst through the front door, and collapsed on the carpet, gasping, the smell of pine and cold metal filling my nostrils. I lay on the cold, shaggy carpet of the entryway for a full 5 minutes, trembling and heaving for air. My parents' house was silent, warm, and utterly safe. I locked every deadbolt and chain on the front door, feeling a desperate, childish need for barriers between me and the night. I stumbled into the bathroom, flicked on the bright fluorescent light, and looked in the mirror. My face was pale and slick with sweat, but otherwise, I looked fine. Then I remembered the stinging pain on the back of my neck. I twisted my neck and angled the small hand mirror. There was no blood, no scratch, but a faint, angry red mark, a shallow burn, circular and precise, about the size of a dime. And embedded in the very center of the red mark was a single, tiny, white fiber. It was the exact same coarse, stiff material as the thread I had seen on the ground at the tree lot. I picked at it gingerly with tweezers until I pulled it out. It was a single, perfect strand. I stared at the thread and the burn mark for a long time, the terrifying reality of what had happened sinking in. Something had been close enough to mark me, fast enough to reach through the barrier of the fence. I threw the thread in the toilet and flushed it 3 times. I never walked past that tree lot at night again. I quit the job a week later, inventing an excuse about school starting early. I told myself that the shadowy figure was just a trick of light on the security covering, and the plastic eye was litter. The thread and the burn were probably just some bizarre allergy or insect bite. But the real fear didn't settle until a year later. I was back home for Christmas break. The entire town was festive. I was helping my mother take out the old decorations. We were standing by the newly set up Christmas tree, a beautiful, fat Douglas fir we had purchased from a different lot this year. My mother handed me a box of lights. "Here, string these up," she said. As I began to unfurl the long, tangled green cord, I noticed something strange about the strand. It was thicker than normal, and some of the wiring looked older and cruder than the rest. I stopped untangling and brought the center section closer to my face. The plastic casing of the wires had been subtly repaired. At several points along the strand, the old insulation had been stripped away and replaced. It hadn't been replaced with electrical tape. It had been replaced with thick, rough white thread, wound tightly around the exposed copper wires. The thread was stiff, almost waxy. My breath hitched. I could feel the cold prickle of recognition spread down my spine. It was the same thread. "What's wrong?" my mother asked, looking over. I forced a casual tone. "Nothing. Just wondering where we got this set. It's patched up." My mother smiled wistfully. "Oh, that old strand. We've had it forever. But a couple of years ago, right around when you were home from college, it completely broke. Every single bulb went out. Your father tried to toss it, but the next morning, it was sitting right back on the counter. He swore he threw it in the trash. He ended up taking it to that little shack at the old tree lot, the one down by the industrial park, and the old man there, the owner, fixed it for free. Said it just needed a little reweaving to hold the current." She paused, then looked at the lights I held. "He did a nice job, didn't he? It's been working perfectly ever since." I dropped the lights. They didn't break. They just lay on the carpet, the white thread patches looking starkly bright against the green cord. I don't know who fixed the lights. I don't know who the white figure was, or what it was cutting and weaving in the dark lot. But I knew that whatever it was, it didn't just want me to stay. It wanted to be let in. It wanted a connection. And by fixing the lights and returning them, it had ensured that every single Christmas, a piece of that dark, silent forest, and whatever was wrapped in its shroud, was brought directly into our warm, brightly lit home. And sometimes, when I'm alone and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear a faint, dry, scratching sound coming from the wall where the Christmas lights are plugged in. This experience is hard to explain because it leaves no real physical trace, just a haunting sense of displacement. It happened 2 years ago, right after I moved into the tiny guest house on my grandfather's estate. He had recently passed away, and my job was to clean out his massive old house before it went up for sale. It was 3 days before Christmas, and the main house was freezing, stacked high with dusty boxes of my grandfather's things. I was focused on clearing out the attic, which was just one huge dark room filled with decades of forgotten junk. I found a trunk full of old Christmas decorations and family albums. The decorations were unremarkable, but the albums were fascinating. They spanned back to the 1920s, showing Christmases I'd never heard about, featuring people I didn't recognize. I was flipping through a thick album from the 1940s when I started noticing something odd. It wasn't in every photo, but in about 1 out of every 5 festive snapshots, there was a strange, subtle element that felt wrong. It was a figure, usually positioned at the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by a tree or a shadow. He was always wearing a deep, heavy coat, even indoors, and a bizarre, oversized head covering that looked like a burlap sack tied tightly at the neck. There were 2 dark, irregularly cut holes where the eyes should be. The first photo I saw him in was a picture of my young grandfather sitting under the tree. The burlap figure was standing in the doorway, half hidden, staring directly at the camera. The second photo was a family portrait by the fireplace. The burlap figure was visible through the window, standing outside in the snow, leaning slightly toward the glass. The third was a picture of an old Christmas dinner. The burlap figure was standing at the end of the long dining table, his back mostly to the camera, but his silhouette was distinct. No one in the photo seemed to notice him. Everyone was smiling, laughing, raising glasses. My stomach started to twist. This wasn't some eccentric uncle or a costume. The presence was always too peripheral, too still, and the mask was too unsettlingly crude. It looked like something built for function, not celebration. I pulled out the photograph of the dinner, my hands shaking. I brought it closer to the weak lamplight, and that's when I saw the detail I had missed. The burlap figure's arm, which hung straight down at his side, was holding something. It was long, thin, and slightly curved. It looked like a single dried-out branch, maybe a piece of mistletoe, but completely withered and black. I called my elderly aunt immediately, trying to sound casual. Did Grandpa ever talk about a family tradition with a strange Christmas character? Someone in a mask. My aunt laughed. Oh, the old Knecht Ruprecht thing? Your great-grandmother loved German folklore. He was supposed to be a companion to Santa, but we never actually had a costume. It was just a story she used to get the kids to behave. Why? I didn't tell her about the photos. I hung up and immediately went back to the attic, frantic now, pulling out every album I could find. I spent the next 2 hours confirming it. The burlap figure was in every single Christmas album, from the 1930s up to the early 1960s, before he abruptly vanished, always on the periphery, always looking at the camera, always holding that dark, withered branch. I was just about to close the last album, an album from 1958, when I saw him one last time. This photo was taken outside the house just after a heavy snow. My grandfather, a young man, was standing on the porch, holding a camera, smiling at the person taking the photo. And right behind him, standing in the dark, open doorway, completely wrapped in shadow, was the burlap figure. But this time, he wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking down, and at his feet, almost invisible in the darkness of the doorway, was a small, red-wrapped package. I slammed the album shut. The silence of the attic was suddenly magnified, pressing in on my eardrums. I was sweating despite the cold air circulating from the eaves. The sight of that red package, sitting innocently by the feet of the unsettling figure, triggered a deep, instinctual alarm. I tried to rationalize it. A recurring joke? A very dedicated family friend who always dressed up? But no friend or relative would spend 3 decades silently creeping into the background of every holiday photo without ever being acknowledged. I scrambled down the dusty, creaking attic stairs and ran to the main hallway of the house. I had to see the actual doorway from the 1958 photograph. The hallway was long and dim, lined with dark, imposing wood. The door that led outside, the one in the photo, was at the very end. I approached it slowly, my flashlight beam cutting a shaky cone of light. I reached the door and confirmed it was still the same door. Heavy, mahogany, with a large brass knob. I looked at the floor right inside the jamb. I was looking for any trace of the package, or perhaps a discolored spot where it might have sat decades ago. Nothing. Just smooth, dark wood. I stood there for a long moment, breathing in the cold, musty air. The house was enormous, and every creak and groan of the old structure felt like a footstep. Suddenly, the floorboards right behind me groaned, a distinct press and creak, as if someone heavy had just shifted their weight on the wood. I whirled around, flashing the light down the long hallway. It was empty. The shadows were deep and dense, but there was no one there. The back of my neck prickled with intense fear. I had been staring at photos of the burlap figure watching my family, and now I felt profoundly watched in the exact same spaces. I backed up, pressing myself against the outside door. I was about to rush back to the safety of the guest house when I noticed something about the door frame itself. The frame was old, thick, and painted with countless layers of ivory paint. Right on the inner edge of the door frame, near the floor, there was a faint, nearly invisible scratch mark in the wood. It wasn't a random scuff. It was a precise, shallow groove, about 2 inches long. It looked like a single sharp claw mark had been dragged downward. I knelt down, bringing the light closer. The groove looked recent, or at least recently disturbed. A tiny, dried-out fleck of what looked like pine needle was caught in the shallow trench of the scratch. As I studied the mark, the air around me grew cold, just like the cold that had chilled my grandmother in the previous story. This was an unnatural cold, localized and intense. The light of my flashlight, which had been bright seconds ago, began to dim. Slowly, agonizingly, the strong white beam faded to a weak, sickly yellow, and then went out completely. I was plunged into absolute, crushing darkness. The only sound was my own frantic, shallow breathing and the deafening thump of my heart. The darkness was total, but the unnatural cold was intensifying, centered right where I knelt by the door. Then I felt it, a light, dry, feathery brush across the top of my head, right where the back of my hair met my neck. It was gentle, almost hesitant, but the sensation of something reaching over me from the darkness above made me seize up. And then a profound sense of recognition flooded my mind, not my memory, but a feeling projected onto me, a feeling that this was the right place. This was the door, and I was the one who needed to receive the gift. I heard a soft, dry rustling right next to my ear. It sounded exactly like old, brittle burlap rubbing against rough wool. I screamed, a strangled, primal sound, and violently threw myself forward, away from the door frame and the sensation of the burlap. I didn't care about the darkness. I scrambled blindly back down the hallway, hitting the wall once, then kicking a loose piece of furniture. I didn't stop until I reached the back of the house and the small, secure door leading to the guest house, where I had lights and a phone. I locked myself inside and spent the rest of the night shivering under the covers. The image of the burlap figure and the cold, oppressive feeling of being chosen, repeating endlessly in my mind. I refused to go back into the main house. I called my aunt the next morning and told her I was sick and that I couldn't continue the cleanup. I flew back to my college apartment that afternoon, abandoning the rest of my grandfather's things. I never told anyone the full story, convinced I'd sound unhinged. I kept the old photo albums locked in a suitcase under my bed. But the burlap figure wasn't quite done with the family. A year passed. It was Christmas again. My parents insisted I fly home to spend the holiday with them. I reluctantly agreed, trying to push the memory of the cold, dark house out of my head. And on Christmas Eve, my mother asked me to help her hang the wreath on the front door. "It's a new one," she chirped. "I found it at that great little antique shop downtown. It feels so traditional, doesn't it?" I picked up the wreath. It wasn't the usual bright plastic holiday cheer. It was heavy, crafted from tightly woven, dried-out pine branches, and tied with a thick, brittle ribbon. It had a dark, ancient smell, like old pine and dust. As I held it, my fingers brushed against the back of the wreath. I paused, woven tightly into the very foundation of the pine branches. Securing the entire circular shape was a strip of thick, rough fabric. It was dark, coarsely woven, and felt distinctly like dried fiber. I knew instantly what it was. Burlap. I slowly turned the wreath over. The burlap strip was sewn meticulously into the wreath, forming part of its structure. But tucked into the center of the wreath, right where the dark burlap strip overlapped, was a single object secured by a wire. It was small, about the size of a fist, wrapped in faded, festive red foil. A gift. I felt the blood drain from my face. This was the package from the photograph, the one that had been sitting at the burlap figure's feet decades ago, now woven into an item meant to welcome guests into my home. "Isn't it lovely?" my mother said cheerfully. "I think the little gift tucked in the center is such a charming touch." I forced a weak smile and quickly hung the wreath on the door, making sure the burlap strip and the package faced the outside, pressed flat against the wood. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. I crept downstairs, drawn by a terrifying curiosity. I walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. The streetlights cast a dim, snowy light on the porch. The wreath was hanging perfectly still. The house was quiet. I was about to turn away, relieved, when I noticed something at the bottom of the wreath. The red foil package was still there, but it was no longer perfectly sealed. A jagged, deliberate tear had appeared in the paper, and sticking out of the tear, just barely visible in the dim light, was a thin, withered branch, the same dark, blackish color I had seen the burlap figure holding in the photographs. As I stared, the branch seemed to twitch just once, pulling the tear slightly wider. I stepped back from the door, the cold dread washing over me. I realized the burlap figure hadn't been waiting for me to open the house. He had simply been waiting for the right way to deliver his gift. And now, thanks to my mother's purchase, the gift, and whatever was inside the burlap, was resting directly against the front door of my childhood home. We still have that wreath. My mother thinks it's a beautiful family antique. I never touch it. But every Christmas Eve, I wake up to the sound of a strange, dry rustling coming from the front door. I never check, because I know that somewhere on the other side, the burlap figure is waiting, guarding the gift he finally managed to deliver to our doorstep. This happened to my father about 15 years ago, but he stopped telling the story after the 5th time, because every time he told it, the details got colder, and the look in his eyes got more distant. It was Christmas night, late. He was driving alone, heading back to the city after visiting his parents up in the mountains of upstate New York. It was a long, desolate route, single lane, surrounded by pitch-black woods, with a fresh, heavy snowfall that made the driving slow and tense. He hadn't seen another car for over an hour. The only illumination came from his own high beams, cutting into the tunnel of falling snow and forest. His radio reception was patchy, mostly static, so he was driving in near total silence. He rounded a long curve where the road straightened out for about half a mile. That's when he saw it. On the side of the road, set back about 10 feet into the shoulder and almost completely swallowed by the darkness, was a small, crudely built snowman. It wasn't a cheerful front yard snowman. It was made of dirty, uneven lumps of snow, and its face was just 2 pieces of coal jammed haphazardly into the middle section. No carrot nose, no scarf, no hat. It looked unsettlingly naked. My father thought, that's odd. Who would build a snowman way out here, and why make it look so depressing? He sped up a little, wanting to get past the strange figure and back to civilization. As he drove past, he glanced in his rearview mirror. The snowman was gone almost instantly, lost in the swirling snow behind him. He drove for another 10 minutes. The road continued its straight, dark course through the woods. He felt himself start to relax again. Then, he rounded the next slight bend in the road, and his headlights cut across the shoulder. There it was again, the exact same snowman. It was positioned in the exact same spot relative to the curve of the road. Dirty snow, 2 uneven pieces of coal for eyes, and no accessories. It even had the same slight tilt to its top section. My father slammed on the brakes. The tires crunched into the snow, and the truck skidded slightly. He looked back, staring into the dark woods and the falling snow. He knew he hadn't circled back. The road had been straight, and he hadn't seen any turnoffs or side roads. He pulled out his phone. No service. He looked at the mileage counter on his dashboard. He had driven exactly 10 miles since he first saw the snowman. He shook his head, heart beginning to accelerate. He figured it must be some kind of sick local prank. A dozen identical, ugly snowmen built every 10 miles to mess with late-night drivers. It was highly improbable, but it was the only logical explanation. He put the truck in drive and slowly moved past the figure, avoiding looking at it directly. He drove for a third time, counting the mileage obsessively. At exactly the 9.8-mile mark, he started gripping the steering wheel so hard his hands hurt. He leaned forward, eyes straining into the darkness, expecting to see the next one. He hit the 10-mile mark. Nothing. Just the endless dark trees and the white snow. He sighed, a massive wave of relief washing over him. The pattern was broken. Maybe the first two were just coincidence. He drove for another half-mile, feeling safer with every rotation of the wheels. Then, his headlights caught a sudden flash of movement, not on the road, but above it. Something dark and fast, traveling parallel to the tree line, just beyond the reach of his high beams. And then, his headlights settled on a small, wooden sign nailed crudely to an oak tree right next to the road. It wasn't a road marker. It was just a piece of unpainted lumber. Scrawled on the lumber in thick, black, tar-like paint was a single, disturbing message. "You missed your exit." My father hit the brakes so hard the seatbelt locked. The back end of the truck slid out onto the shoulder. He looked back at the mileage counter. He had driven exactly 10.5 miles from the last known snowman sighting. He put the truck in reverse, backing up slowly, his heart hammering in his throat. He reversed 0.5 miles, bringing the counter back to 10.0 miles since the last sighting. He looked over, and there it was again, the snowman. But this time, it was positioned in the middle of the road, completely blocking his path. The snowman stood directly in the center of the narrow road, its 3 ugly lumps of dirty snow unmistakable. It hadn't been there a second ago when he was looking through his rearview mirror during the sudden stop. It was now directly in front of his truck's bumper. My father sat rigid, staring at it through the windshield. The headlights cast a stark, white glare on the crude figure, making the 2 black coal eyes look unnervingly deep and purposeful. He checked the rearview mirror again. The section of road he had just traveled was absolutely empty. The snowman wasn't appearing every 10 miles. It was somehow appearing immediately after he passed a certain point, or perhaps with him. A wave of crushing, claustrophobic panic hit him. He wasn't just on a deserted road, he was caught in a horrifying loop, and this crude figure was the key to the repetition. He slowly put the truck in drive and nudged the gas pedal, inching forward. He intended to drive around the snowman, even if it meant risking the ditch. As the truck moved toward it, the snowman didn't move, but as the bumper got within 5 feet, the coal eyes seemed to shift. He heard a sudden, loud, metallic clatter from underneath the vehicle, followed by a violent thud against the truck's undercarriage. My father jerked the wheel, pulling the truck sharply to the side, and managed to swerve around the snowman, scraping the passenger side tires dangerously close to the deep snowdrift in the ditch. He didn't look back. He floored the gas pedal, speeding down the road, his heart pounding a frantic, irregular rhythm. He drove hard for 5 minutes, pushing the truck far faster than was safe on the icy road, desperate to break the sequence. Desperate to see a sign for the city, any sign of civilization. He looked down at the mileage counter. He had covered 5.2 miles. He rounded a slight curve, and his high beams cut into the darkness ahead. The road was blocked, not by a snowman this time. A massive pine tree had fallen across the road, its sharp, dark needles and heavy branches completely spanning the lane. It was a fresh fall. He could see the raw, pale wood of the trunk where it had snapped. He slammed on the brakes, stopping just feet from the tangle of branches. He slumped against the steering wheel, utterly defeated. He was trapped. He was forced to reverse. He checked the mileage. He was 15.2 miles from the first snowman sighting. He had to go back 5.2 miles to get to the 10-mile sighting location, which he was now certain would be blocked. He put the truck in reverse and backed up slowly. The entire time, he strained his eyes in the rearview mirror, dreading what he would see. After reversing for almost 5 miles, he reached the exact curve where he had seen the 2 identical snowmen and the sign. He turned the truck around, and his headlights swept across the desolate shoulder. The snowman was gone. The road was clear. The ominous wooden sign that read, "You missed your exit," was also gone. But lying directly in the center of the road, glistening in the headlight beam, was a massive, fresh pile of black coal. It looked like the entire contents of a coal sack, dumped right there. My father drove slowly onto the coal, The tires crunched, ground, and slipped, kicking up black dust. As the truck passed over the pile, he felt a series of distinct, heavy thumps underneath the cab. He finally drove past the pile and sped down the road toward where he thought his exit should be. He pushed the truck to its limit. He drove for a long time, 10 minutes, 15 minutes. He checked the mileage. It was now 0.0 miles. His counter had reset. He knew then that he was no longer driving in a normal dimension. He was perpetually stuck in the first 10 miles of this desolate road, forced to repeat the loop until what? He rounded the next long curve, the tension in his chest an unbearable ache. And there it was, on the side of the road, set back 10 feet, in the exact position as the very first time. The snowman. But this time, it was different. The snowman was perfectly, cleanly white. It had been freshly rebuilt, and instead of 2 rough pieces of coal for eyes, it had 2 small, bright, red glass ornaments. They reflected his headlights with a cold, festive malevolence. My father felt a cold, sharp dread that eclipsed the simple panic of being lost. The reset mileage counter and the perfectly white snowman, now accessorized with bright, cruel red eyes, told him that he was no longer dealing with a prank or a natural phenomenon. He was caught in an eternal repetition, and the rules had just changed. He didn't hit the brakes. He kept the truck moving, deliberately forcing himself to maintain a slow, steady speed toward the figure. He saw that the snowman had acquired a new feature. A single dark stick arm had been pushed into its middle section, and this arm was extended, pointing directly at the truck. As he got closer, he realized the stick arm wasn't just pointing, it was holding something. Dangling from the end of the brittle branch was a small, crudely tied bundle of dried pine needles and a thin, white card, a tag. He didn't swerve this time. He drove straight, aimed to pass it on the left. As the truck passed the figure, my father glanced quickly to the side. The snowman's red eyes seemed to burn with a focused light, and he clearly saw the writing on the tag. You need to give back what you took. The air in the cab instantly turned frigid, and a heavy, damp smell of wet coal and frozen pine filled the truck. My father sped up again, pushing the truck to 60 miles an hour. He drove with desperate urgency, ignoring the 10-mile marker completely, convinced that if he could break the established pattern, he could escape the loop. He drove for 15 minutes, 20 minutes. The woods stretched endlessly, and the snow continued to fall in heavy, monotonous flakes. He checked the mileage counter, expecting another reset. But it didn't reset. The counter read 20.8 miles. He had finally driven more than 10 miles without the world resetting around him. He was out. A huge, shaking sob of relief escaped him. He rounded the next curve, and ahead, he saw the blessed, familiar sight of a major road sign. It read, City Limits, 5 miles. He slowed down, his heart rate gradually dropping from a terror-induced sprint to a tired, shaky rhythm. He was safe. He drove past the sign, and as he did, he glanced down at the passenger seat. Lying on the black vinyl, where he was sure nothing had been a moment ago, was a small, perfectly round object. It was one of the snowman's old eyes, a piece of black coal. It was smooth, dry, and cold to the touch, and it was nestled right next to his glove compartment. He felt the immediate, sickening cold return to the cab. He knew what he had done. When the snowman first blocked the road, he had felt that metallic clatter as he drove past it. He must have dislodged the snowman's eye, one of the original, crude components, and the figure had reset and repeated the loop, waiting for him to recognize the mistake and return the missing piece. He grabbed the piece of coal and shoved it into his jacket pocket, convinced the loop would reset if he didn't give it back. He drove another 2 miles, desperately searching for a place to turn around. Then, his headlights caught the first sign of civilization. Small, brightly lit gas station and convenience store. He screeched the truck to a stop by the air pump. He ran inside the warm, fluorescent-lit store, paid for his gas, and fumbled for the red phone booth outside. He called the police, stammering out a story about a massive fallen tree blocking the road. The officer who answered sounded calm and bored. "Sir, we have the records. There are no roads blocked up that way. The road has been clear all night. It's the main route to the city." My father insisted, describing the exact location of the 10-mile marker. The officer finally said, "Sir, the road you're describing, there is no 10-mile stretch without an intersection or a turnout, and we don't have a single call about a fallen tree. Are you feeling all right?" My father hung up, realizing he had driven for 20 miles in a reality that simply didn't exist, created solely by the strange entity on the road. He threw the piece of coal from his pocket into the snowdrift next to the phone booth. It was over. He got back into his truck and drove toward the city, putting the whole experience behind him. But my father never drove that road again. And every Christmas morning since that night, my parents receive a strange gift. It arrives in an unmarked brown package, addressed in crude, black lettering. It's always a different item: a pair of old tarnished driving gloves, a worn black woolen scarf, a broken flashlight, and every single gift, without fail, is wrapped tightly in a thick layer of dirt-stained snow and contains one single, perfectly round, smooth piece of black coal. He never gave back the second eye. This happened to me not long ago, during the first Christmas after my daughter Lily passed away. She was 7, and her absence didn't just feel like grief. It felt like a cold, empty hole carved out of the center of our small house. My wife and I didn't put up a Christmas tree that year. We couldn't bear the thought of stringing lights and hanging ornaments that she would never touch again. We were just trying to survive the season, moving through the days like ghosts. The house was terribly quiet. The silence was the worst part. Lily had always been noise, singing, tapping, bouncing a ball. Without her, the house felt vacuum-sealed. On Christmas Eve, I was in the living room, staring out the window at the snow. My wife was upstairs, trying to sleep. The only light came from the neighbor's porch, casting long, fractured shadows through the blinds. Around 11 p.m., I heard it, a faint, mechanical whirring. It was a very specific sound, instantly recognizable, though I hadn't heard it in months. It was the winding mechanism of Lily's favorite toy, a small wooden music box shaped like a tiny church. When you opened the lid, a small ceramic angel would spin, and it played a slightly tinny, sweet rendition of Silent Night. I hadn't seen that music box since the spring. My wife had meticulously packed away all of Lily's toys into sealed bins and stored them in the locked utility closet in the basement, just off the laundry room. She couldn't bear to look at them. I knew exactly where that music box was, in a sealed bin, inside a locked closet, deep in the basement. The whirring stopped, followed by a soft, melodic tinkle as the tune began. The sound was faint, muffled by the house, but utterly distinct. Silent Night. I sat perfectly still, holding my breath, listening to the impossible song. It was coming from downstairs. I told myself it was the neighbors, or maybe a car radio passing by. But the sound was consistent, steady, and the walls of the basement were thick concrete. The music sounded like it was right beneath my feet. The song played for maybe 30 seconds. Then it wound down, the notes sinking in pitch until they became an agonizing, drawn-out groan, and stopped. The silence that followed was terrifying. I got up, walked to the basement door in the kitchen, and pulled the key off the high hook where we kept it. The brass key was cold in my hand. I hesitated, standing at the top of the dark wooden steps. I took a deep breath, and as I reached for the light switch, I heard a new sound from below. It wasn't the music box this time. It was a single, gentle thud. It sounded like a book falling softly onto a carpeted floor, a small, familiar sound that shouldn't exist in the bare, concrete basement. I flipped the light switch. The bare bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered weakly, casting long, jittery shadows. I started down the steps, moving slowly, cautiously. The air down here was heavy with the smell of old concrete and dust. I reached the bottom landing. The entire basement was empty, save for the washer and dryer. The utility closet door was at the far end, in the darkest corner. I could see the thick brass padlock on the utility closet door. It was secure. Nothing had been opened. But lying just outside the closet door, right on the dusty concrete floor, was a single object. It was a small, cloth-bound book. I recognized the cover instantly. It was Lily's favorite picture book, The Little Angel's Christmas. I hadn't opened the basement since the bins went down there. The book could not have gotten out on its own. I stared at the padlock on the door, then at the book on the floor. I walked over, my footsteps echoing unnaturally on the concrete. I picked up the book. It was slightly damp and cold, and as I held it, a deep, sorrowful sigh whispered from the other side of the utility closet door. The sigh was unmistakably close, dry, and heavy, sounding as if the person who made it was pressed right up against the thin wood of the utility closet door. It wasn't my wife. Her breathing was far too light. I stumbled backward, the book slipping from my grasp to land with a muffled thud on the concrete. I stared at the door, then at the heavy brass padlock. The lock was solid. The key was in my pocket. My mind raced. A squatter? But how could someone possibly get into a locked, sealed closet in the middle of a basement without leaving a trace? And why would they sigh like that? My adrenaline spiked, pushing out the fear, replacing it with a cold, desperate resolve. I had to know what was behind that door. I fumbled with the cold key in my pocket and shoved it into the padlock. The mechanism grated loudly as I turned it. I yanked the padlock free, threw it onto the floor, and reached for the doorknob. Just as my fingers wrapped around the brass, I heard the next sound. It was very faint, and it was inside the closet. It was a delicate, rhythmic tapping. It was the sound of a small, hard object knocking against a smooth surface, like a toy tapping the side of a plastic bin. It was coming from low down, near the floor of the closet. I ignored the tapping, gripped the knob, and pulled the door open hard. The light from the basement bulb flooded the small utility closet. It was stacked to the ceiling with clear plastic bins. I could see the sealed lids, the neatly labeled sides, Lily's toys, winter clothes, old linens. Everything was exactly as my wife had left it. And there, right on the top bin labeled Lily's Toys, was the wooden music box. It was closed, still. I scanned the floor. There was no one, no movement, no air disturbed. Yet the tapping had been insistent, coming from that low corner. I dropped my gaze to the darkest corner of the closet floor, where the pipes met the wall. Tucked almost entirely out of sight, under the lowest shelf, was a forgotten, tattered item that hadn't been packed away. It was Lily's oldest possession, a stuffed bunny, worn threadbare, with one ear missing and both plastic eyes scuffed. She had named him Skipper. I slowly walked into the closet, feeling the oppressive cold return, the same unnatural cold I had felt the moment the music started. I bent down and reached for Skipper. As my fingers brushed the rough fabric of the old toy, the tapping started again, right next to my hand. Tap, tap, tap. I froze. I pulled the toy out gently, and I saw what was causing the sound. The bunny's remaining ear was missing its inner wire, causing it to flop loosely. Taped crudely to the inside of that floppy ear, with a small piece of old, yellowed masking tape, was a tiny, dried-out bird's beak. Every time the light current in the closet shifted, the ear flopped, and the stiff, dry beak tapped against the plastic bin on the shelf above. The tapping I heard was the toy knocking against its own sealed storage container. I felt a wave of icy sickness. Why was the beak there? And who taped it? My wife and I didn't let Lily play with dead animals. The toy had been clean when we put it away. I pulled the music box off the shelf and opened the lid. The ceramic angel inside was spinning fast, but the winding mechanism was still. It wasn't playing a song. Instead, a low, quick hissing sound was emanating from the open box, like air escaping a pinhole. I looked back at the empty basement door. The sigh had been too real, too close. I closed the music box lid just as I heard a voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was a clear, small, breathy singing. It was Lily's voice. It was singing Silent Night, but the song was mangled. It was being sung backward. The lyrics were unrecognizable, but the melody, reversed and distorted, was sickeningly familiar. The voice was coming from the narrow, dark space between the back of the stacked bins and the concrete wall. And it was moving. It was slowly, deliberately retreating up the wall, the sound getting fainter as it moved toward the ceiling, singing the song backward as it went. The sound of my daughter's voice, small and clear, but singing her favorite carol backward, retreating up the empty space behind the bins, was the final, devastating breach of reality. It wasn't just a sound. It felt like a physical reversal, undoing the structure of the house's silence. I backed out of the closet slowly, my eyes locked on the narrow, dark gap between the bins and the wall. The singing faded into a faint, high-pitched whimper, then stopped completely as the voice reached the ceiling of the basement, directly under the living room. I didn't lock the closet. I ran up the stairs, taking them two at a time, shedding the oppressive cold of the basement as I went. I burst into the kitchen, slamming the door shut and leaning against it, gasping for breath. The living room felt normal, warm, silent, and empty. The shadows were just shadows again. The only evidence of the terror below was the icy sickness pooling in my stomach. I knew the voice wasn't her. It was something using her memory, her sound, and her toys to break the seal we had placed on our grief. The reversed song, the bird's beak taped to the ear of her oldest toy. It felt like a grotesque, dark ritual meant to unmake her final piece. I checked on my wife. She was asleep, tucked beneath the blankets, her breathing light and even. I didn't wake her. I couldn't risk bringing this horror into her fragile peace. I stayed awake all night, sitting rigid on the edge of the sofa, watching the kitchen door. The house remained silent, the silence now feeling different. It was heavy, watchful, and strangely satisfied. When the first gray light of Christmas morning filtered through the blinds, I finally went downstairs to the basement. I fully expected the closet door to be open, the bins scattered, the music box gone. The basement was calm. The utility closet door was closed, just as I had left it. The small padlock was still on the floor where I had tossed it. The concrete was dry. The little picture book, The Little Angel's Christmas, was no longer on the floor. It was gone. I didn't open the closet. I didn't need to. I knew the book had returned to the collection, sealed again in the darkness. I spent Christmas Day trying to forget the impossible night. That evening, my wife woke up, saw the gray light, and gently walked into the living room. She looked around the empty room, her eyes lingering on the spot where the Christmas tree usually stood. She smiled faintly, a genuine, albeit sad, expression that I hadn't seen on her face in months. "The house feels quiet," she murmured, sitting next to me. "But it's a calm quiet, isn't it? Not an empty one." I nodded, unable to speak. "I had the strangest dream last night," she continued, her voice soft. "I dreamed Lily came home. She didn't say anything, but she was smiling, and she left me a gift." She reached into the pocket of her bathrobe and pulled out a small, round object. It was one of the buttons from Lily's favorite winter coat, a tiny, smooth, white button. It was cold to the touch. "I found it lying right on the pillow next to me this morning," she whispered, her eyes shining with inexplicable peace. I know it sounds silly, but it felt like a little Christmas gift from her. I looked at the button, my mind reeling. The song, the tapping, the sigh. They had achieved their goal. The strange, cold presence had broken the seal of our grief and delivered a final, tactile object. It hadn't come to hurt us. It had come to give a finality that we, in our sadness, had denied our daughter. My wife's peace has held. She is happier now, lighter, as if a great weight was lifted. But the price of that peace is something I can never tell her, because sometimes, when I walk past the utility closet door in the basement, I feel the lingering cold, and I swear I can hear, very, very faintly, the almost inaudible click of a small ceramic angel spinning endlessly in the dark. This happened to my cousin, Eli, 10 years ago, and it's the reason he refuses to look at anything related to the sea now, even in pictures. He was a caretaker for historic properties, and his last gig was the old Oak Haven Lighthouse, perched on a desolate, rocky peninsula in northern Maine. It was late December, and Eli was supposed to spend 2 weeks winterizing the structure. The lighthouse itself was massive, a 100-year-old stone tower attached to a small, 2-story keeper's cottage. It was completely automated, so the huge lights swept the sea every night, but no one lived there permanently. Eli loved the solitude at first. The vast, empty ocean, the silence broken only by the crash of the waves and the moan of the wind. He was alone for Christmas, but he brought a tiny box of decorations, tinsel, some string lights, and a small battery-powered radio he hoped would pick up a carol or two. He spent the first few days making the cottage habitable, battling the cold, damp air. On the evening of Christmas Eve, he decided to start the climb up the tower to check the main light mechanism one last time. The spiral staircase was a long, dark ascent of iron steps. It was freezing and smelled strongly of salt and old oil. As he climbed, the wind outside began to pick up, whistling through the narrow window slits. When he reached the top, the massive rotating lens was whirring softly, throwing its huge beam across the turbulent black water. He finished his checks and started to head back down when he heard a noise. It wasn't the wind. It was coming from the lantern room itself, right over the glass. A soft, scraping sound, like dry, sharp claws gently dragging across the thick glass enclosure. Eli stopped dead on the iron staircase. He looked up at the curved glass walls of the lantern room. The light beam swept around, momentarily illuminating the glass, then plunging the room back into shadow. He walked over to the windows, his heavy boots echoing on the metal floor. He looked out into the night. The only thing outside was the sheer drop to the jagged rocks and the churning water below. Nothing could possibly perch on the steep curve of the glass, 100 feet above the sea. The scraping repeated, a deliberate, slow hiss against the glass, right above his head. Eli told himself it was just the wind, whipping some grit or ice crystals against the tower. He backed away, trying to keep his breathing steady. He turned to leave, and that's when he noticed something wrong with the lighthouse's main mechanism. The huge light fixture was supposed to rotate at a smooth, constant speed. But as he watched, the rotation subtly slowed down. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It was a deep, almost lazy change in momentum. The beam dragged across the water, then slowed even further as it passed the rocky peninsula. And as the beam moved at this slower pace, Eli noticed the shape of the light projected onto the wall of the tower. It wasn't a clean, clear oval. The light beam was mottled, distorted by a shadow. He looked up at the lens itself. On the curved glass wall facing the sea, a dark shape had appeared. It was opaque and roughly round, the size of a large dinner plate. The shape wasn't on the outside of the glass. It was inside, pressed against the inner surface of the lens, and it was slowly, minutely growing. It looked like a vast, flat fungus, blooming on the glass, consuming the light. Eli felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He was alone, locked in a stone tower with a massive, slowing light, and something was spreading across the glass, drinking the illumination. And as he stared, fixed on the growing dark stain, the scraping sound returned. This time, it wasn't on the glass. It was muffled, wet and rhythmic. It was coming from the iron staircase he had just climbed. It sounded like something heavy and dragging was beginning a slow, upward ascent. Page 2. The Ascent of Iron. My cousin Eli pressed himself against the outer stone wall of the lantern room, the cold seeping through his thick woolen sweater. He was trapped. The only way down was the winding iron staircase, and the dragging, wet sound was climbing it, getting closer with sickening momentum. He couldn't see anything on the stairs yet, as the final turn was just below the landing. But he could feel the vibrations. The heavy, scraping sound wasn't the rhythmic movement of human limbs. It was a continuous shudder transmitted through the metal structure. It sounded like something vast and soaked, being hauled upward. His breath hitched, turning to white mist in the freezing air. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He felt the irrational urge to scream, but the wind was howling outside, a noise so immense it would drown out anything he could muster. He forced his eyes up to the main lens. The light continued its slow, heavy rotation, sweeping the black sea. The dark, amorphous shape on the inner glass had grown significantly. It now covered nearly a quarter of the lens, effectively sucking the light out of that section of the beam. The massive lamp was struggling, its hum lowering in pitch as if fighting to push energy through the blockage. He realized the growing shadow was somehow feeding on the light itself. As the wet scraping sound reached the landing just below, Eli focused on the darkest part of the shadow on the lens. The texture wasn't flat. It had an uneven, bumpy surface. And deep within the darkness, illuminated by the remaining light, he saw tiny, intermittent glints of red. They were not lights. They looked like small, scattered reflections bouncing off something hard and curved. They were the size of small, decorative berries, or perhaps something even smaller and more unsettling. The dragging sound stopped. The vibrations ceased. Eli knew whatever was on the stairs had reached the top landing. He was standing, maybe 20 feet from the entrance, completely exposed. He slowly moved his gaze from the glass to the iron spiral staircase entrance. The gap was pitch black, a throat leading up into the light. A thick, syrupy black liquid began to drip slowly from the top step onto the metal floor of the landing. It wasn't water. It was too viscous, catching the meager light with a faint, oily sheen. Then, a massive, uneven shadow began to stretch up and across the wall of the lantern room, cast by the slowly rotating light. The shadow was enormous, disproportionate to the width of the staircase. It was wide, bulky, and its upper edge was not smooth. The shadow was crowned with a series of distinct, sharp spikes, giving it a chaotic, jagged silhouette that scraped against the stone walls as the light moved. It looked like a vast, decaying creature with a crown of broken antlers. The creature didn't move past the top step. It just stopped there, right at the threshold, its massive, spiked shadow dominating the small room. Eli didn't see its face or its body, only the distorted, terrifying shadow it cast. He felt the air grow impossibly heavy, laden with the smell of brine, decay, and something else, a faint, unmistakable aroma of rotting tinsel. He understood then. This wasn't a sea creature. It was a collector, a thing that came for the light and the forgotten cheer of the isolated. He knew he couldn't fight it. He had to extinguish the light. If the light died, maybe it would lose interest. He began to back away toward the control panel, his eyes locked on the spiked shadow that guarded the doorway. Eli had one thought: darkness. He lurched sideways toward the control panel, a small metal box mounted to the wall near the railing. His sudden movement sent a wave of fresh terror through him, but the shadow didn't lunge. It simply remained, massive and spiked, guarding the staircase exit. He reached the panel and slammed his hand against the largest, most prominent button, the emergency shutoff for the main lamp. The effect was instantaneous. The mighty hum of the rotating mechanism died with a shuddering thunk. The immense beam of light stopped its rotation, halting mid-sweep, leaving the entire lantern room plunged into the deepest possible darkness. The only light left was the tiny, pathetic green indicator light on the control panel, and the faint, silvery reflection of the moonlight off the snow on the distant coast. The moment the light died, the spiked shadow vanished. The air in the room was no longer cold. It was suffocatingly heavy, thick with the smell of wet decay. Eli stood completely still, unable to see anything, listening desperately for movement. A soft, unsettling squelch sounded near the staircase entrance, followed by the sound of something dragging slowly across the metal floor, moving into the lantern room. It was slow, quiet, and absolutely intentional. Eli flattened himself against the stone wall, trying to make his breathing silent. He felt a light, dry tap on the crown of his head, followed by a fleeting, feathery brush on his cheek. It was gone before he could react. He didn't see anything, but he felt an invisible presence moving past him, moving straight toward the huge, dead lens. A few seconds later, a low, wet sigh echoed from the glass enclosure. It was a sound of profound relief, or maybe satisfaction. Then, he heard a new, distinct sound coming from the lens itself. The sound of shattering glass, not a violent crash, but a slow, continuous crackling, like ice breaking off a tree in a winter storm. He risked turning on his small, pocket-sized emergency light. The beam was weak and yellow, but it was enough. He shone the light toward the massive lens. The dark, fungal shape was still there, spread across the inner glass. But now, all the dark matter was slowly flaking off, falling down onto the floor of the lantern room. It was shedding its skin, revealing the lens underneath, and clinging to the very center of the inner lens, where the dark patch had been thickest, was the creature. It was small now, no bigger than a large sack of potatoes, its body a matted tangle of seaweed, old rope, and what looked like brittle, dark tinsel. It had dozens of small, spindly limbs, all actively scraping at the glass, feeding on the remnants of the dark patch. Its back was covered in the jutting, broken-off pieces of its spiked crown, and scattered across the metal floor, where the dark, flaking matter had fallen, were hundreds of tiny, gleaming fragments of red glass. They weren't broken light bulbs. They were tiny, shattered pieces of Christmas ornaments. The dark entity had climbed the tower, bringing the detritus of 100 ruined Christmases, the decay of tinsel, the shards of glass ornaments. and used them to block and feed on the singular, continuous light. The creature paused its frantic feeding and tilted its head, revealing 2 pinpricks of blackness in the tangle of its head. It had sensed the emergency light. It dropped a final, large piece of the dark shedding onto the floor. Eli shone his light on the fallen object. It was a small, desiccated starfish, completely covered in dried-out, silver-colored glitter. The creature then began to move, not toward the staircase, but toward a narrow, rarely used maintenance hatch that led straight outside, down the sheer stone wall. It had achieved what it came for. Eli did not wait for it to leave. He turned, ran back to the iron staircase, and descended as fast as he could, his boots slipping and banging on the steps. He reached the cottage, locked himself in, and sat there until dawn. When the police arrived the next day, called by the Coast Guard because the light had failed, they found the lantern room clean. The dark matter was gone. The glass was immaculate, but the maintenance hatch was wide open, jammed with pieces of dried pine and tinsel. And on the metal floor of the lantern room, where the light should have been brightest, they found one single item left behind. It was a small, perfectly preserved Christmas bauble. It was deep red, perfectly round, and completely unbroken. It was covered not in dust or salt, but in a slick, dark, oily substance. And stuck to the middle of the ornament, pressed flat against the glass, was a piece of the creature's shed material, a piece of brittle, dark burlap. It was a gift. Eli left the peninsula immediately. He never told the full story, but he believes the creature wasn't attacking. It was simply collecting the lonely, broken elements of Christmas and leaving its own souvenir. And he knows that every Christmas Eve, the old lighthouse light will dim because the entity is climbing, searching for what's forgotten, and waiting for the next lonely caretaker to deliver its strange, dark gift.